I was sitting in the cozy dining room at my son's house, the savory scent of Hetty's roasted chicken still lingering in the air, when my phone vibrated on the table. Mr. Elmer Jenkins's voice was a whisper, but it hit me like a bucket of ice water down my back. "Wilbur, who is in your house?" At that moment, the fork in my hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. How could anyone be there when I was miles away at my son's place trying to mend old fences? But Elmer's heavy breathing over the line did not lie. "Hello, everyone. My name is Wilbur Porter. The story I am about to tell you is not just about a break-in. It is about the moment a mother realizes the child she once sheltered has become a terrifying stranger. If you are listening to this, please hit that like button and let me know which city you are joining me from. Your presence is my greatest comfort right now." Everything truly began on a Tuesday morning, a typical Georgia morning, with air so thick you could almost taste the dew. I was standing in my kitchen, running my fingers over my favorite ceramic mug, thinking about brewing a hot cup of coffee to soothe my aching back. Right then, the door swung open without even a knock. Gary burst in, his breath heavy with the scent of stale tobacco and a sharp impatience. He did not look me in the eye. Instead, he stared straight at the wooden cabinet where I kept the important papers from the farm I had just sold. Gary demanded $25,000 right then and there for some investment, but the way his voice dropped low made it feel more like a forced seizure of property than a request. When I shook my head and told him that money was my retirement, he reached out and swiped the mug right out of my hand. The sound of that ceramic shattering on the floor felt like my own heart cracking open. I stood there frozen, looking at the sharp shards scattered across my Skechers. Gary did not offer a single word of apology. He stood there, tall and unfamiliar, looking at me with a coldness I had never seen in 38 years. "You are going to regret being so selfish, Mama," he threatened before turning his back and walking out. He left the air in the room feeling heavy and tight. A numbing sensation crawled up my spine. I felt like I was being stripped of my own life inside the home I had built. My entire world, the one where a son respects his mother, just crumbled away. I had to ask myself, when did families start being measured by the cold numbers on a check? I sat quietly in the shadows of the living room, the faint moonlight through the window highlighting the old scratches on my coffee table. My knees were starting to throb, a familiar ache after so many years of hard labor on the Porter family farm. I closed my eyes, and memories came back like a slow movie. I could almost smell the sweet scent of hay and damp earth from the old barn, a smell that meant home for 40 years. I could still feel the phantom touch of my late husband's rough, calloused hand on mine, reminding me that we built that life together, row by row, for the sake of our children. I remembered the harsh Georgia sun beating down on my back while I harvested vegetables, pinching every penny so Gary could go to college and have a brighter future. That $25,000 he just demanded was not just money. It was the sweat and blood of 3 generations of Porters who poured their lives into that soil. I had accepted selling my only heritage, the place tied to the memory of my husband, just to make sure I could age in peace without being a burden to my children. I thought back to 5 years ago, when I emptied my savings to pay off his debts, believing his promise to start over. I have always been a generous mother, putting my child's needs above my own health and my own retirement plans. A cold clarity began to take over my mind, washing away the last of my illusions. I started to see a repeating pattern, as clear as the rows of corn we used to plant in the old fields. Gary only called when his gambling debts were piled high like mountains. He only visited when his truck was about to be repossessed by the bank. Every "I love you" Mama was always followed by a plea for a loan that was never repaid, wrapped in complaints about his hard life to manipulate my compassion. I had unintentionally become a passive victim of my own maternal instincts, always hoping that my grace would make him change. The way he looked at my safe today, with that hunger and aggression, said it all. He did not need my love. He only wanted to seize the fruits of my entire life. The sadness that once weighed down my chest suddenly turned into a sharp, cold anger. I stood up, ignoring the stiffness in my joints. I do not need him to protect me. I need to be protected from my own son. Enough, I whispered into the quiet air. The era of my silence has officially ended right here. The next morning, I woke up as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the curtains, illuminating tiny dust motes dancing in the quiet, peaceful space of my bedroom. For the first time in months, that heavy, suffocating blanket of anxiety about Gary's demands was gone, replaced by a fresh energy flowing through my tired bones. I carefully slipped my feet into my ash-gray Skechers, feeling the soft memory foam cushioning and supporting my arches that usually ache from years of hard work and arthritis. I decided to step out onto the porch to breathe in the crisp, clean suburban air. I spent a good hour meticulously pruning the rose bushes along the walkway, a gardening hobby I had let go because my mind was always too cluttered with worry. The sound of the birds chirping mixed with the sweet smell of fresh-cut grass felt like a beautiful symphony, making me realize how vibrant the world still is when you aren't chained by fear. I sat down and turned on my Amazon Kindle, choosing a light romance novel, and felt a wave of relaxation spread over me, a true sense of liberation from the psychological weight I had been carrying. Later that afternoon, I picked up the phone and called Elmer Jenkins, my kind neighbor who I hadn't spoken with deeply in a long time. Elmer's voice was warm and deep, carrying the comfort and reliability of a long friendship that I had unintentionally pushed to the side. We talked about the upcoming social gathering at the church and even joked about taking one of those river cruises through Europe I had seen on TV. Something I used to think was too much of a luxury for someone like me. That simple conversation restored my faith in people and washed away the loneliness that had started to surround me. I felt empowered as I started making a list on Amazon to upgrade my home for safety, looking at motion sensor nightlights and non-slip mats for the bathroom. Taking charge of my life and making these small, independent decisions gave me a powerful sense of hope for what lies ahead. I am no longer just a mother waiting for a phone call. I am a woman claiming her own peace. Thursday afternoon, as I was standing at the kitchen counter arranging my bottles of glucosamine and vitamin D I had picked up from Costco, the phone suddenly vibrated. Seeing Gary's name flash on the screen made my heart skip a beat, a familiar habit of old anxiety rising up in my chest. But when I answered, his voice was no longer harsh or rude like it had been that morning. Instead, he used a deep, sweet tone that felt strange and hollow, like a 5-year-old child trying to charm his mama for an extra cookie. He started with a clumsy apology about the broken ceramic mug, then shifted into asking about my health with a kind of concern that felt practiced rather than real. I stood there leaning against the edge of the granite counter, my hand gripping the phone tight, just listening in silence. I noticed the long pauses he deliberately created, an old technique meant to make me feel like I was being too hard on him. My silence stretched on so long that I could hear his heavy breathing and his growing impatience on the other end of the line. After a while of that circling around, Gary started to lean into the main issue with a voice full of misery. He told me about the pressure of debts closing in on him, about how Hedy had cried her eyes out because she was terrified of the bank repossessing their car, and how he felt so trapped in this cruel world. He tried to paint a picture of a total disaster, hoping that the natural instinct of an African American mother would make me soften up and offer help just like I always did. I could feel the manipulation in every single word, the way he was trying to turn his own mistakes into a burden the whole family had to carry. However, instead of rushing in to comfort him, I answered in a voice as calm as a still Georgia evening. I told him briefly that I was sorry for his situation, but that my financial decisions were now fixed for my own retirement. That was the first brick I laid down to build a boundary for myself, and a steady sense of resolve began to take the place of my old confusion. When he realized that being sweet was not getting him anywhere, Gary's voice started to shift, carrying a sharp edge of blame. He asked me if I really wanted to see my own son out on the street, and he started reminding me of all the times he had helped me mow the lawn or fix things around the old farm just to make me feel guilty. This was always the strongest weapon he used to take away my power. But this time, I looked out the window where Elmer was working in his yard, and I remembered that feeling of peace I had while reading on my new Kindle. I did not let him go on with his list of complaints. I cut him off politely but firmly, telling him that I had a meeting at the church and needed to head out right away. I took the lead and ended the call before he could find another way to ask for money. When I put the phone down, my hands were shaking just a little bit, but my mind was perfectly clear. A surge of confidence filled me as I realized I was no longer a passive victim in this quiet struggle for my own life. I was sitting on my lazy boy recliner in the living room, trying to let the tension drain from my tired legs after a long day of working in the garden. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that usually brings me peace, until the sudden, sharp metallic sound of a key turning in the front door lock shattered the silence. Before I could even catch my breath or stand up, the door swung open with a violent force. Gary stood there in the entryway, his hand still gripped around that old brass key I had foolishly forgotten to take back months ago. He did not knock, and he certainly did not offer a greeting. He just barged in like he still owned every inch of this floor. The smell of cheap tobacco and a frantic, nervous energy followed him inside, making the air in my cozy room feel thick and suffocating almost instantly. I felt a cold jolt of fear shoot down my spine, leaving my hands like ice as I watched him. He looked around the room with a bitter, scouting expression, his eyes lingering on the portrait of my late husband on the wall, as if he were searching for something hidden or valuable. The sense of safety I had spent days carefully rebuilding for myself just crumbled away under this raw, uninvited intrusion. Gary began to pace across the living room rug, his heavy work boots leaving dark, muddy streaks on the floor I had just spent all morning cleaning. He did not stay still for a single second, moving with a restless, twitching energy like a predator that had finally been backed into a corner. I stayed as still as a statue in my chair, my fingers digging into the wooden armrests to keep them from shaking, watching every sharp move he made. His eyes kept darting toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, right toward the spot where I kept the small fireproof safe containing the Porter family's legal and financial records. The room, which usually felt like my sanctuary, was now vibrating with a tension so heavy it felt like a storm was about to break right in the middle of my home. I realized then that this was not a son coming to check on his mother. This was a calculated invasion intended to strip away whatever little I had left. The silence between us was so heavy and loud that the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown to something terrible. Suddenly, the silence snapped as Gary began to scream, his voice raw and ugly, demanding that $25,000 once again. He pointed a shaking finger at me, calling me a selfish and cruel woman for sitting on a pile of money while he was drowning in debt. He talked about the money from the sale of the Porter farm, as if it were a jackpot I had won in a lottery, completely ignoring the 40 years of backbreaking labor I had poured into that red Georgia clay. His voice echoed off the walls, louder than the wind outside, filled with insults and old, rotted grievances. He demanded to know exactly where I had hidden the legal papers, his eyes wide and wild with a look of pure intimidation. I looked at this man, the son I had once cradled and protected, and for the first time, I saw a total stranger trying to use my own guilt to push me into an early grave. He did not care how I would survive or how I would pay for my medication. He only cared about feeding his own bottomless greed and covering up his gambling mistakes. The anger I had been suppressing for years suddenly flared up inside me like a fire that could no longer be contained. I stood up from my chair, ignoring the sharp, biting pain in my arthritic knees, and I began to list every single sacrifice I had made for him since the day he was born. I reminded him of the sleepless nights I worked to put him through college, and the thousands of dollars in gambling debts I had quietly paid off over the years, just to keep him out of a jail cell. I told him about the new clothes I never bought for myself, and the vacations I turned down just so he could have every advantage I never had. My voice was shaking with emotion, but it was firm, and every word I spoke felt like I was finally cutting the final chord of my own suffering. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that the Porter legacy was not built to be thrown away in some dirty, smoke-filled casino. This was the first time I had the courage to look at his betrayal in the light and call it exactly what it was. When Gary saw that his usual manipulation was not working anymore, he ripped off his mask and showed a face so greedy it made my blood run cold. He let out a dry, hateful laugh and told me that everything in this house and every penny I had would eventually be his anyway. Why should I have to wait until you are dead when you are just standing in the way of what is legally mine? He spat, his words so poisonous they made me shiver. He did not even bother to hide his intentions anymore, admitting he wanted to take it all right now, whether I was still breathing or not. His total lack of respect for my life and the sweat I had put into my home made me feel a deep physical disgust. He stood there in my living room, surrounded by our family memories, and tried to claim ownership over the very life I was still living. That was the moment I truly understood that any love he once had for me had been completely incinerated by his own selfishness. Gary stepped closer to me then, using his height and his bulk to try and scare me, a physical tactic he had never dared to use before. He leaned in and threatened that he would have my rights taken away by calling social services, claiming I was no longer mentally fit to handle my own money. He stood so close I could feel the heat of his breath on my face, creating an atmosphere of pure pressure and fear. But the fear I felt earlier was being replaced by a spine of steel that was rising up from deep inside my soul. I realized that if I backed down now, I would not just lose my money, I would lose my freedom and my dignity as a human being. I did not flinch or look away from his shadow. I stood tall and kept my hands steady, preparing myself for the final struggle to protect my honor. His threats only made me more certain that I had to cut this toxic connection once and for all. I did not waver and I did not cry as he continued to insult me. Instead, I walked over to the front door and threw it wide open, letting the humid Georgia air rush in to clear out the smell of his tobacco. I used every bit of strength I had left to point toward the driveway, and I told Gary he had to get out of my house right this second. He looked shocked by my sudden hardness, and he tried to step toward me to argue, but I did not give an inch. My eyes were burning with a resolve I had never felt in my entire life. I told him he no longer had the right to set foot in this home, and that I would never sign another piece of paper for him as long as I lived. The power of my own wounded pride gave me the energy to hold that door open and stand my ground. Seeing that I would not be broken, Gary finally stomped out of the house, leaving me with one last look of pure, concentrated hatred. As soon as his shadow crossed the threshold, I slammed the door shut and turned the deadbolt with a loud, final click. I leaned my back against the heavy wood, my heart racing and my whole body shaking from the absolute exhaustion of that emotional storm. Outside, I heard his truck engine roar to life, and he yelled one last threat through the glass about how I would be begging him for help when the bank came to take everything. I slowly slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, feeling like I had just survived a battle that cost me everything I had emotionally and physically. The house was quiet again, but I knew deep in my soul that the bond between a mother and her son had been broken beyond repair. Even in my state of collapse, I felt a strange, new sense of relief because I had finally stood up for myself. This was only the beginning of my fight, and I knew I had to act immediately to build a fortress around the life I had left. The next morning, I woke up with a mind that felt unusually clear, as if a heavy fog had finally lifted from the corners of my brain. The old, paralyzing confusion was gone, replaced by a cold and steady realization that being a mother did not mean I had to offer myself up to be devoured. I understood now that maternal love could no longer be used as an excuse for Gary to strip away my safety and my dignity. My first step was reaching out to my community at the church, the people who have known my heart for decades. Through a quiet recommendation from one of the deacons, I found Mr. Henderson, a lawyer who specialized in protecting the rights of seniors. He was a man with a calm, deep voice and a way of listening that made me feel seen and respected, rather than just another case file. As we sat in his office, I told him the whole story, and he did not judge me for the years I spent being too soft or too forgiving. He explained the legal protections available in Georgia and mapped out a strategy to safeguard the money from the sale of the Porter farm, money that represented the sweat of my ancestors. Having a professional standing by my side, someone who represented justice and truth, felt like a massive weight was being lifted off my spirit. I began the methodical process of gathering every important document I owned, from my birth certificate to my retirement records, and every piece of evidence showing how Gary had abused my trust in the past. Taking these logical steps one by one helped me reclaim my sense of being the master of my own life, turning my old, formless fear into purposeful action. Securing my physical home became my top priority so I could finally sleep through the night without jumping at every shadow. I immediately called a reputable local locksmith to change every single lock in the house, from the heavy front door to the back porch and even the small window in the bathroom. Watching those old keys, the ones Gary had used to violate my private boundaries, being gathered up and replaced with a high-security deadbolt system brought me a profound sense of relief. It was as if I was finally taking the keys to my life back into my own hands. After the locksmith finished, I went onto Amazon and ordered a complete home security system that included outdoor cameras and motion sensor nightlights. I spent the afternoon carefully installing them in the blind spots around my property, making sure that any suspicious movement would be recorded and sent directly to my phone as an alert. My home was no longer a porous place that anyone could barge into. It was slowly becoming a true fortress of peace tailored just for me. Now, when I hear a small noise in the yard or the wind rattling the branches, I don't catch my breath in terror anymore. I just check my screen and see that I am protected by the systems I put in place with my own hands. I then moved to establish a total financial defense at my local bank, making sure there were no cracks left for greed to seep through. I requested to close every old account that Gary might have had information on from his years of snooping through my papers. A brand new bank account was opened, protected by multiple layers of security and multi-factor authentication that only I could access through my private devices. I also worked with my bank manager to move the bulk of my savings and the proceeds from the farm into more secure retirement funds that were strictly managed. Every old power of attorney or legal authorization I had signed during my weaker, more confused moments was officially revoked and destroyed. Under the watchful eye of Attorney Henderson, I replaced them with new, ironclad legal documents that reflected my true wishes and protected my autonomy. There was a beautiful clarity in seeing the numbers and the ownership laid out so clearly on paper. I realized that protecting my assets wasn't about being selfish. It was about honoring the lifetime of hard work I had put in and the legacy of the Porter family. Being in total control of my own money gave me a new level of confidence in my plan to age in place right here in my own home, without having to depend on anyone who didn't have my best interests at heart. During this time, I also took the opportunity to review all my essential services and my health insurance to make sure my foundations were solid. I carefully checked my Medicare statements and made sure there were no unauthorized changes to my beneficiaries or my contact information. I even signed up for a mail-order pharmacy service for my daily medications, which not only saved me money, but also meant I didn't have to go out when I wasn't feeling up to it, while keeping my medical needs private. Every utility bill, from the electricity and water to my high-speed internet, was set up for automatic payment from my new secure account. This removed the constant worry about service interruptions and ensured that no outside interference could mess with my daily comfort. Organizing my life in such a logical and systematic way made me feel like every day was finally back under my own management. This busyness did not make me feel tired. Instead, it fed me with the strength I needed to face whatever challenges might come next. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a fragile, bullied old woman anymore. I saw a resilient queen rebuilding her own small kingdom with wisdom and grace. Finally, I took the necessary step of cutting off all digital ties with Gary and anyone who might be helping him with his schemes. I blocked his number on my phone and deleted the social media accounts we had used for family updates. That initial silence from my phone felt a little strange at first, like a phantom limb, but it was very quickly replaced by a wonderful, deep serenity. I no longer had to live in fear of a fake sweet phone call or a toxic, threatening text message popping up and ruining my day. Now, I spend my evenings in the quiet of my living room, reading my favorite books on my Kindle, or watching high-quality programs on PBS without any interruptions. That feeling of safety has returned to every corner of this house, settling into the floorboards and into every breath I take. I am finally living for myself, and for the first time in a very long time, the air in my home feels light and pure again. The next morning, I was standing on my porch, just staring blankly at my rose bushes. The petals were bruised and scattered from the emotional storm of the night before, and I felt just as worn down. Then, I saw a familiar shadow moving across the grass. It was Elmer Jenkins, walking slowly toward me with that steady, rhythmic pace of a man who has seen many seasons come and go. He wasn't coming empty-handed. He was carrying a plastic tray with a stack of warm, golden cornbread and a small thermos that I knew was filled with black coffee. Elmer stopped at the bottom of the steps, his kind eyes looking at me from under the brim of his cap, with a quiet understanding that didn't need a single word of explanation. He told me he had heard some sounds that weren't exactly peaceful late last night, and just wanted to make sure I was still standing tall. His presence right then felt like a warm lamp pushing back the cold shadows of the isolation that had been wrapping around me like a shroud. I invited him to sit in one of the wicker chairs on the porch, and a lump formed in my throat. I realized that even if your own flesh and blood turns their back on you, there are still good, decent souls out there ready to reach out and pull you back into the light. I found myself just letting it all out, telling Elmer about everything that had been happening, from the shattering of my favorite ceramic mug to the ugly threats Gary made about taking away my right to make my own decisions. Elmer listened with his thin, weathered hands folded in his lap, nodding slowly as I spoke. He didn't judge me, and he didn't tell me I had to just take it because of family ties. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye and told me that I had every right to protect myself and the legacy of the Porter family. He shared that he had noticed a strange truck belonging to Otis Raines lingering around the neighborhood lately, and he promised he would be keeping a much closer eye on everything happening around my property from now on. His support wasn't just kind words. He told me he was ready to stand as a witness for me before anyone who needed to hear the truth of what he had seen. For the first time in so many days of living under a cloud of fear and mental pressure, I felt my breathing finally become light and easy again. My faith in human kindness, something I thought Gary had stolen from me, was being restored right there on my own front porch. Elmer's visit was like a healing balm, giving me the spiritual strength I needed to keep going on this journey of protecting my honor. I realized in that moment that I wasn't nearly as alone as Gary wanted me to feel. Besides Elmer, I had my community at the church and my old friends that I had pulled away from because I was carrying a shame that didn't even belong to me. We sat there together for a long while, sharing that simple breakfast under the soft morning sun, talking about normal things instead of the heartbreak that had been following me. Elmer reminded me about the strength of our roots and the value of my own soul, things that no one has the power to strip away unless I let them. The warmth from that tray of cornbread seemed to spread from my hands right into my heart, leaving me feeling deeply moved and incredibly grateful. I stood up when he finally left, feeling my feet planted much more firmly on the ground. I felt ready to face whatever was coming next because I knew I had true allies standing right behind me, ready to protect my peace. After several days of keeping a careful watch over my own front door, I decided it was finally time to reclaim every inch of my home, starting with the guest room. This was the small space where Gary would stay whenever his pockets were empty and his luck at the casinos had run out. The air inside that room felt heavy with the scent of old wood and the faint, lingering smell of his cheap tobacco on the heavy curtains, which always seemed to make me feel a bit uneasy and restless. As I started moving the heavy mahogany dresser to wipe away the thick dust that had settled behind it over the years, my hand brushed against something that did not belong in a clean house. Hidden deep behind the back panel, tucked away like a guilty secret, was a bundle of files wrapped tightly in a thick plastic bag. My heart started thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird when I realized these were not my family records or my bank statements. Inside that cold plastic was a stack of legal documents and an old tablet I thought Gary had gotten rid of months ago. As my fingers touched the chilly surface of the bag, a shiver of dread ran right down my spine. A deep feeling that a terrible betrayal was about to be brought into the light of day. I carried that bundle over to my dining room table, sitting under the soft yellow glow of the Georgia afternoon sun, and began to unwrap the dark secrets my only son had worked so hard to hide from me. I sat right there on the floor with my back against the wall, my hands shaking like leaves in a storm as I turned on that old tablet and saw the messages between Gary and a man named Otis Raines, Every word that flashed across that bright screen felt like a sharp blade cutting right through my heart and my memories. They had been talking for many months, starting the very moment I finished selling our beloved family farm, whispering back and forth about a plan to take every single thing I owned. I saw hand-drawn sketches of my house showing exactly where my safe was hidden, and detailed notes about when I left for church and when I went to bed. But the thing that made my stomach turn over was a draft for an illegal and forged power of attorney document. The most sickening part was a message Gary sent to Otis that said, "The old lady will never know. Once this is signed, the whole farm property will be mine before she even realizes she has lost everything." All those times he apologized for breaking my things or invited me over for a family dinner were just a performance, a cold and calculated play to steal the fruits of my entire life of labor. A total and absolute clarity took hold of my mind then, wiping away every last bit of doubt or lingering hope I had left in my soul. I used my own phone to take a clear picture of every single page and every one of those hateful messages on that tablet, so I would have evidence that could never be denied by a judge. My hands were not shaking anymore. They had become steady and filled with a fierce purpose I had never known before. I immediately sent every photo and document over to Mr. Henderson with a subject line that simply said, "Evidence of the plot to take my property." This was the key, the secret weapon I needed to end these days of being controlled and to save the honor and the legacy of the Porter family. The deep pain I felt at first was replaced by a strange and quiet peace. Because the lies were finally over and the truth was out, I realized that looking at the truth, no matter how much it stings the heart, is the only way for a woman to truly be free. After hitting send on that email to Mr. Henderson, a bone-deep exhaustion settled over me. It felt like Gary's betrayal had finally wrung the last bit of spirit out of my soul. I moved slowly toward the back porch, seeking the shade of the ancient oak tree that stood like a silent guardian at the edge of what used to be the Porter farm. This was George's favorite spot. My late husband spent thousands of hours here, tending to rows of greens or hunched over a piece of equipment that needed fixing. The Georgia sunset began to bleed across the horizon, bringing with it the scent of dry leaves and the cool, damp breath of the earth. It pulled back the curtain on memories so vivid I could almost see him standing there. I sat in his old wooden chair, the one worn smooth by time and his presence. I remembered his hands, rough, calloused from years of pulling life out of the dirt, yet always so gentle and protective when they held mine. This pain was not just about the money Gary tried to steal. It was the crumbling of a sacred trust we had built together over 40 long years. In the deepening quiet of the evening, I found myself starting a silent conversation with him. I closed my eyes and let the world drift away until I could hear the low, warm rumble of his voice in my mind, reminding me of what it meant to carry the name Porter. George used to say this land was not just property. It was our dignity, the proof that we stood our ground and made something of ourselves through every storm. I knew in my heart that he would never allow 3 generations of hard work to be tossed away in some smoke-filled casino by a greedy child. The memory of his teachings on integrity and backbone began to weave through the cracks in my broken heart, wrapping around me like a thick wool blanket on a freezing winter night. I felt an immense, quiet love from him, a spiritual comfort that told me I was never truly walking this path alone. He was there in the rustle of the leaves and the steady beat of my own heart. As the last sliver of daylight vanished and the Georgia night took over, a strange, new peace settled into my bones. I was not just a tired old woman being bullied anymore. I was the keeper of the flame for the Porter family honor. George had entrusted this legacy to me, and I realized I had a holy responsibility to protect it at any cost. I would not let Gary's lies or his greed stain the memory of the man who gave his life to this soil. I stood up from that old chair, feeling my legs find a strength they had not known in years. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a resolve as hard as iron. I looked up at the vast sky, where the stars were beginning to pierce through the dark, and I whispered a promise to my husband. I told him I would not break, and I would not back down. George's memory is my armor now, and I am ready to stand through whatever storm Gary tries to bring. Monday morning in Georgia arrived with a heavy, thick humidity that seemed to press against the window panes, promising a day that would test my spirit and my bones. I was standing in my kitchen, the heart of the home George and I had built together, reaching for a small tin of herbal tea. My joints were acting up, a dull, throbbing ache in my knees and hands that always served as a reminder of the decades I spent working the soil of the Porter farm. I was just looking for a little warmth to soothe the arthritis when a sharp, sudden knock echoed through the hallway, a sound so clinical and cold it made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't have to wonder who was there. I simply turned my head toward the small monitor of the security system I'd recently set up to protect my peace. Through the lens, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, dressed in a charcoal gray business suit that looked out of place against the vibrant green of my front yard. She was clutching a thick, leather-bound portfolio to her chest like a shield. When I opened the door, the air between us felt immediately charged with a quiet, professional tension. She introduced herself as an investigator from Adult Protective Services. Her voice neutral, but her eyes scanning me from my head to my Skechers. She stated she was here because of an emergency report, a claim that I was showing signs of severe memory loss and was no longer capable of caring for my own basic needs. In that moment, my heart felt like it had been gripped by a fist of ice. I knew exactly whose signature was at the bottom of that report. Gary was finally trying to do what he'd threatened. He was trying to turn my own mind into a prison, painting me as a confused, helpless old woman so he could step in and seize control of every penny of the farm money. I took a long, slow breath, tasting the damp morning air, and forced my voice to remain as steady as the oak tree in my backyard. I invited her into my living room, the very place where the history of the Porter family was told through the photographs on the mantel and the smell of old wood and beeswax. The investigator sat on the edge of my sofa, her pen poised over a pad of paper, and began a series of high-pressure questions that felt like an interrogation under the guise of concern. She asked me for the exact date, the names of my doctors, and the specific amounts of my most recent bills from the water company and the bank. She mentioned that the report, Gary's report, claimed I was frequently leaving the stove on, forgetting to take my blood pressure medication, and making large, unexplained cash withdrawals that I supposedly couldn't account for. Each question felt like a calculated jab at my dignity, an attempt to strip away the autonomy I had worked my whole life to earn. I felt a surge of helplessness trying to drown me, realizing how easily a son's whispered lies could trigger an entire system designed to watch and judge me in my own sanctuary. But I looked at the portrait of George, remembered his quiet strength, and refused to let my hands shake. I answered every single question with a quiet, razor-sharp precision that seemed to catch her off guard. As the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly suffocating under her clinical gaze, I decided it was time to change the tide. I reached for my phone and called Mr. Henderson, my attorney. He arrived in less than 15 minutes, his presence bringing a calm, focused energy that acted like a barrier between me and her suspicions. My attorney didn't waste a second. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew the truth was on our side. He presented the investigator with my most recent medical records from my primary care physician, documents that were signed and dated just a week ago. Those papers clearly stated that I was in excellent health for my age, with no signs of Alzheimer's, dementia, or any other cognitive decline that would prevent me from managing my own life. I watched the investigator's eyes as she read the reports, her professional skepticism beginning to melt away as the hard facts replaced Gary's fabrications. The indignation I felt earlier was transforming into a fierce, unbowed resilience. I was no longer a victim being cornered, but a woman standing on the solid ground of her own reality. The real turning point came when we brought out the secret weapon I discovered in the guest room. We laid out the copies of the messages between Gary and Otis Raines on the coffee table, right next to the investigator's tea. I showed her the cold, heartless words they'd exchanged about staging a theft and forging a new power of attorney while I was distracted. We showed her the detailed notes Gary had made about my safe and my daily habits, evidence not of a son's concern, but of a predator's calculation. I spoke to her in a voice that was soft, but carried the weight of 40 years of hard labor on the farm, explaining how Gary had violated my boundaries, intimidated me in my own home, and was now trying to use the medical system as a weapon to finish what he started. The investigator's pen slowed down as she began to see the true pattern. A story of a desperate, greedy son trying to bury his mother alive in legal paperwork. Just as the investigator was beginning to cross-reference our documents, Gary himself appeared at the door, accompanied by a man he claimed was a highly respected local specialist. Gary burst in with a performance that made my stomach turn, acting like the devoted, heartbroken son who was only trying to protect his failing mother from her own confusion. He spoke in a hushed, urgent tone, trying to convince the investigator that I needed an immediate psychiatric evaluation at a private clinic he had already pre-selected for me. He used big, clinical words he barely understood, trying to create an atmosphere of crisis and chaos, hoping I would finally lose my temper and give him the evidence of instability he so desperately needed to take my rights away. The tension in the room was like a physical weight, a suffocating attempt to pull the floor out from under me one last time in front of a government witness. Instead of shrinking away from his looming shadow, I stood up from my chair, my spine as straight as the pines that line the Georgia highways. I looked him directly in the eye and told him, and the investigator, that I flatly refused to go to any doctor Gary had chosen or paid for. I stated clearly and loudly that if any further evaluation was deemed necessary by the state, I would only submit to an independent board of medical professionals appointed by the court, people who had no ties to Gary, Otis Raines, or the Porter family finances. Mr. Henderson immediately backed my demand, filing a formal request for my legal protection on the spot and challenging the credentials of the man Gary had brought to my home. I saw a flash of pure, ugly rage cross Gary's face as his trap snapped shut on empty air. His good son mask was slipping, revealing the raw greed underneath. My clarity and my absolute refusal to be moved were the strongest things I had, making his attempt to paint me as a helpless victim look like the desperate, hollow act it truly was. The interrogation eventually ended after several grueling hours that left me physically drained, but spiritually ironclad. The investigator closed her portfolio, admitting that the report Gary had filed looked less like a medical concern and more like a malicious attempt at financial manipulation. Before she walked out the door, she looked at me with a slow nod of respect and advised me to keep my legal shields high, stating she would be recommending a full investigation into the whistleblower instead of the target. Gary stood on my porch, completely stripped of his excuses, his eyes burning with the realization that he had run out of places to hide. I closed the door on him and turned the deadbolt with a finality that echoed through the house, feeling a profound exhaustion in every joint, but a deep, unshakable peace in my mind. After the house was finally quiet again, I sat in my kitchen and finished the tea I had started hours ago, which was now cold but still brought me a strange comfort. The bitter taste reminded me of the road I was walking, a path that was hard, steep, and filled with thorns, but one that was leading me toward the light of truth. I had been pushed to the very edge, forced to defend my own sanity in the house I had paid for with my own life's blood. But I had not crumbled. I knew Gary was not finished, and I knew the final battle would take place in a courtroom where the stakes would be even higher. But I was no longer afraid of his shadows. I had the truth. I had the support of my community and my ancestors, and I had the strength of the Porter name behind me. I was ready for the final judgment, where the light of justice would finally wash away the last of the lies and return my life to me, whole and holy. I remember that afternoon so clearly, a time when the Georgia heat felt like it was standing still outside my window. A man in a dark professional suit appeared at my door, his face as cold and unreadable as the stone on a grave. In his hands, he held a thick, heavy envelope that felt like it carried the weight of my entire future inside its paper skin. When I pulled those documents out, the words Superior Court of Georgia stood out in bold, lifeless ink. It was the formal notification that my own son was filing for full guardianship over me, claiming to the world that I no longer had the mental capacity to handle my own life. Holding those papers, I felt a sudden, sharp chill run down my spine, the kind of shock that makes your body go numb before the pain even has a chance to set in. I walked back into my living room and set those papers on the dining table, right next to the small scar in the wood floor where my favorite ceramic mug had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The house was quiet, but it was a heavy, suffocating kind of silence, the kind that settles over the land just before a massive storm breaks the sky open. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Henderson, knowing deep in my soul that the time for being patient and hoping for the best had officially come to an end. Just a few days before the hearing was set to begin, an offer for a settlement was sent over from Gary's lawyers. They called it a smooth solution for the family, but as I read through those lines, I saw it for exactly what it was. A clever trap designed to bury me while I was still breathing. They wanted me to voluntarily give up my rights to the money from the Porter farm and move into a high-end nursing home that Gary would choose for me. If I agreed to hand over the keys to my life, he promised he would drop the lawsuit. Gary even tried to call me from a number I didn't recognize, his voice sounding tired and full of a fake kind of sorrow. He whispered that he was only doing this because he loved me and it was for my own best interest. I sat in Mr. Henderson's office, where the smell of old law books and worn leather usually brought me a sense of peace. My attorney analyzed every word with a cold, professional eye, explaining that this agreement would strip away my freedom entirely and turn me into a dependent, relying on the mercy of a son who had already proven he had none. The room felt smaller as we picked apart the legal details, the tension growing thicker as I realized Gary was trying one last time to manipulate my heart before we stepped into the light of the court. It didn't take me long to reach my final decision. Looking at the tiny, cramped print in that settlement offer, I understood that Gary was desperate. He was terrified of what would happen when a judge saw the evidence I had discovered hidden in my own guest room. I looked at Mr. Henderson and told him to reject every single condition they had offered. I was not going to trade my dignity or the legacy that George and I had spent 40 years building just to buy a fake kind of peace. A strange, deep quiet took over my mind then. The kind of stillness you feel when you finally stop trying to fix something that has been broken beyond repair. We spent the rest of that afternoon reviewing our strategy one last time. We went over every screenshot of those hateful messages, every bank statement showing his greed, and the detailed witness statement from Elmer Jenkins. Every document we touched felt like a brick being laid to build a wall of protection around my future. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a new life, ready to face the truth without any fear or shame holding me back. That final evening, Elmer Jenkins came over with a fresh pot of hot coffee and a plate of his homemade biscuits. We sat in my warm kitchen, and the air felt different than it had in weeks. It was clear and honest, without the heavy weight of Gary's lies hanging over us. Elmer calmly went over everything he had seen and heard, his steady, neighborly voice giving me a tremendous amount of comfort. My attorney called one last time to remind me about the small details, what to wear, and how to keep my voice steady when I spoke to the judge, his words full of professional encouragement. I took a slow walk through my house, looking at the new security cameras and the heavy locks on the doors, and I felt a real sense of safety that I had fought so hard to win back. I didn't see a victim in the mirror anymore. I saw a woman who was standing up for her right to live her life on her own terms. The house grew very still as the night deepened, but it was the quiet of a soldier who is finally ready for the battle that matters. I closed my eyes and felt the resilience of the Porter name flowing through my veins, ready to step out of the shadows and into the light of the truth. The morning of the hearing, the air inside the Clayton County Courthouse in Georgia felt heavy and clinical, carrying a sharp chill that seemed to seep right through my dark wool coat. I walked into that courtroom with my hands clasped tightly together, feeling every single heavy thud of my heart against my ribs. On the other side of the room, Gary was already sitting there with his lawyer, wearing a cheap suit and a face that was disturbingly calm. Every so often, he would turn his head and give me this look of fake, practiced concern, the same emotional weapon he had used to manipulate me for years. Hetty was sitting a few rows behind him, her eyes red and swollen, looking down at her lap as if she couldn't bear to see the wreckage her husband had caused. I looked at the polished wood of the benches and the way the morning light caught the dust motes in the air, feeling a wave of intense suspense wash over me. This was not just a legal meeting about guardianship. This was the place where I had to fight for my right to be a free woman against the most cruel and calculated lies a son could tell. Gary's lawyer began the proceedings with a voice that was smooth and full of a hollow kind of sympathy. He spent 20 minutes painting a portrait of me as a 68-year-old woman who was slowly drowning in a sea of confusion and anxiety. They stood there in front of the judge and argued that I was no longer capable of managing the retirement money from the Porter farm, claiming that I was a prime target for scams and needed Gary's financial protection to survive. Every single false accusation that echoed through that quiet room felt like a sharp slap to my dignity. They even produced a stack of unpaid utility bills, documents that I knew in my heart Gary had stolen from my mailbox, just to create a paper trail of my supposed neglect. I felt a surge of helplessness as I watched the judge lean in and listen to those fabrications. However, I kept my back as straight as a pine tree, remembering Mr. Henderson's words about keeping my peace of mind even when the psychological attacks were at their worst. When it was finally time for us to speak, Mr. Henderson moved with a quiet, razor-sharp precision that immediately changed the energy in the courtroom. Our first witness was Elmer Jenkins, my dear neighbor who had been a steady light in the darkness for so many years. Elmer's voice was deep and steady as he described my daily life, telling the court how I managed my home and my garden with a clear mind and a sharp eye. He spoke about the evening Gary forced his way into my house, describing the aggression and the threats he had heard from across the fence with his own ears. Elmer's presence was like a warm glow of truth that started to push back the shadows of the lies Gary had told. After Elmer stepped down, we presented my official medical records and the results of the independent psychiatric evaluation, which completely tore apart every claim Gary had made about my mind failing. I saw the confident look on Gary's face begin to crack and crumble as the facts started to weigh more than his performances. The most powerful moment of the entire hearing came when Mr. Henderson stood up to present our secret weapon, the evidence I had found hidden behind the dresser in the guest room. He moved to the large screen at the front of the court and displayed the screenshots of the messages between Gary and Otis Raines. The entire room fell into a deathly, hollow silence as everyone read the cold words Gary had written about staging a theft and plotting to strip his own mother of her autonomy. It was the undeniable proof of a financial abuse scheme that had been planned with a terrifying level of greed. I watched Gary as he slowly lowered his head, no longer able to look at me or the judge. A feeling of pure, righteous satisfaction began to bloom in my chest as the truth was finally dragged into the light of justice. All his efforts to paint me as a victim had turned into a permanent record of his own betrayal. The judge eventually asked me to stand and give my final testimony. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the strength of my ancestors and the memory of George Porter lifting me up. I did not talk about numbers or checks. I talked about the 40 years of labor I had poured into that farm and the love I had given to my husband and my only son. I spoke about the deep, biting pain of having to stand in a courtroom against the person I brought into this world just to protect my right to grow old with respect. My voice was clear and carried a weight that seemed to make people in the back of the room lean in. I told the court that the Porter legacy was meant to feed a future of honor, not to pay for the habits of a man who had lost his way. That was the moment I realized I had finally taken back my voice and the power that Gary had tried so hard to steal from me. After a short but agonizing break for deliberation, the judge returned to the bench to deliver the final ruling. Gary's petition for guardianship was dismissed in its entirety because it lacked any real evidence and was clearly filed with malicious intent. The judge did not stop there. She gave Gary a stern and public reprimand for his dishonorable behavior and ordered a full investigation into the attempted financial abuse he had coordinated. A wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy crashed over me, and I felt tears finally start to fall. The kind of tears that only come after months of holding your breath in fear. I walked out of that Clayton County courthouse and saw that the Georgia sky was a brilliant, vibrant blue, looking more beautiful than I had ever seen it. Justice had been done, and the crushing weight of that betrayal was finally lifted off my shoulders forever. I was a free woman, a Porter, and I was finally going home to a house that belonged only to me. 6 months have passed since the final judgment was delivered, and I eventually decided to sell the old house that was filled with too many heavy, painful memories. I moved to a smaller, beautiful apartment in Savannah, where the rooms are flooded with warm Georgia sunlight every single morning. In this new space, I have finally discovered what it truly means to age in place with absolute safety and a deep, quiet peace in my soul. Every morning, I take my time slipping into my comfortable Skechers and heading out for a slow walk through the local park, feeling the vibrant energy of freedom flowing through my veins with every step I take. I have spent these months returning to the passions I had long forgotten, while I was busy carrying the weight of Gary's greed. I spent hours tending to the bright, colorful flowers on my balcony, and every evening I treat myself to my favorite cooking shows on Netflix, savoring the simple joy of a life that belongs only to me. Looking back at that long, difficult journey from this distance, I no longer feel the sharp sting of the pain. Instead, I see a profound reflection of my own worth and the strength I didn't even know I possessed. I have found myself again, shaking off the heavy shroud of silence and ready to walk into a bright future where I am the only master of my own life. If you are listening to this, I want you to remember that we as seniors are not just passive victims waiting for life to happen to us. We have the absolute right to make every single decision about our finances and our personal lives without being manipulated by anyone hiding behind the name of family. Loving your children and forgiving them does not mean you have to allow financial abuse or emotional cruelty to take root in your home. Having a sharp eye on your neighbors and having a professional legal shield like Mr. Henderson is the strongest way to protect yourself from being isolated and exploited. Protecting the fruits of your lifelong labor is not a selfish act. It is a brave and holy act of guarding your own dignity and the honor of your family legacy. My name is Wilbur Porter, and I am proof that it is never too late to stand up for yourself and claim the peace you have earned. Thank you for listening to my story, and please remember to hold on to your light and your power, no matter what shadows try to cross your path. Thank you for sharing this time with me. It means so much to have you here. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to hear it. We are never alone when we stand together. Stay strong, keep your light shining, and stay blessed until next time.